I'm calling in from a remote location. I just want to make sure that y'all can hear me okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Thank you. Also, Rishtya, I'm really looking forward to your presentation. I'm looking forward to both presentations, but I'm super interested on the child abuse piece. So thank you for presenting.
Thank you so much. And I've been a fan of your work for a while, so I'm so glad to finally be able to connect with you.
Oh, yay!
And I'm excited to hear Bushra's too.
Yeah, me too.
Inshallah, it'll be a good discussion. Inshallah.
Perfect. Nothing like when panelists already like each other. I got to go thank Mary Firdausi for this one. She's the one who puts the panels together. All right, perfect. I am ready to share my screen if Anne-Marie, you wanted to let everybody in, and we will begin.
Real quick, I'm sorry. I just switched to earphones. Can you also hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
All right. Okay, let's see here. Salam alaikum. Good afternoon. This is track B, Interpersonal Violence, just to make sure that we're all in the right group. It is my honor to introduce our panel of esteemed speakers this afternoon. We have with us today Dr. Rishtya Kakar. She's a public health doctoral candidate in the Department of Health Promotion and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Louisville, where she previously earned her master's in public health. She completed medical school at Shifa College of Medicine in Islamabad, Pakistan. For the past 2 years, she has been conducting research on exploring the opportunities for prevention of child sexual abuse in American Muslim communities. We also have with us today Alia Salem. She's the founder and executive director of Facing Abuse in Community Environments, or FACE. Alia is a co-founder of the Palestine Action Committee of Texas, PACT, and an active board member with the North Texas Fair Housing Center. She is also a published writer and a public speaker. We also have with us Sara Bawany. She's a social clinical worker, an award-winning published poet, a writer, and a freelance editor. A graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, she received her master's degree in social work and her bachelor's degree in biology and Islamic studies. She self-published her first book in September 2018, titled Wholehearted, a collection of poetry and prose, which won Daybreak Press Publishing's Best Poetry Book Award. Her work has been featured on TEDx, the Muslim Youth Musings Literary Magazine, Voyage Dallas Magazine, and Brown Girl Magazine. We also have with us today Bushra Husain. She is the co-director of non-residential services at Sanctuary for Families. She graduated from Columbia University with a master's in social work with a focus on clinical practice and international social welfare policy. Ms. Husain is currently a second-year doctoral student at Rutgers University School of Social Work, and she is a founding member of the South Asian Task Force Against Domestic Violence at Sanctuary for Families, as well as the New York State Coalition to End Forced and Child Marriage. Finally, we have with us Ikram Adawe. She's a licensed clinical social worker and a certified advanced alcohol and drug counselor. She's currently a sexual assault therapist at Michigan State University. She is trained in different trauma treatment modalities. Welcome all.
Welcome to everybody else who's just joined us. We're ready to begin our panel. There's a slight shift in how we're going to do things. We're going to start with culture change around abuse in community spaces. The screen's all yours, Alia and Sara.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and begin presenting. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. All right, assalamu alaikum, everybody. We're really excited to be here on behalf of FACE. My name is Sara Bawany. I'm FACE's licensed clinical social worker, and we also have Alia Salem, our executive director, presenting today. Alia.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Alia Salem. I'm the founder and executive director, as Sara mentioned, and we're really excited to be here today for the second year in a row. And I think you'll really enjoy what we have to share with you today. Sara, take it away.
Thanks. So our presentation today is called Culture Change Around Abuse in Community Spaces. But before we get to that, we wanted to introduce a little bit more about ourselves and who we are. So FACE stands for Facing Abuse in Community Environments, and we were a nonprofit founded in about May of 2017. So we're coming up on 4 years now, with a mission to foster safe community environments by holding abusive religious and community leadership accountable. We are a framework of about 7 disciplines or so: Islamic theology, law, social work or mental health, grassroots organizing, organizational development, journalism, and finance. We aim to be victim-centered, trauma-informed, survivor and women-led, community-based, and we investigate cases based in the US and Canada at the moment. Basically, a lot of things that we're known for include, education programs for the community on how to create safe, sacred spaces, as well as our investigative reports, which have become really well known in the last couple of years. Right now, we're only 2 staff members, so it's myself and Alia kind of bearing a lot of the burden, but it's been wonderful having a board of so many talented subject matter experts, and they've contributed in current and past to how our organization is today. So to go into just a couple of statistics, sometimes people ask us how big of a problem really is abuse by clergy and community leadership. And so we always tell them that even though we're a really baby organization, just since our inception in May 2017, we've received 113 allegations from the US and Canada and globally. Even though we don't technically collect, we don't take on investigations beyond the US and Canada, we still do receive allegations, so that number is reported in there. As of currently, we have 44 open investigations, and as I mentioned, with 2 staff members, that can be a little bit difficult sometimes. But it just shows the need that this organization has had for the community and how prevalent of a problem this really is. Since our inception, we've also published 3 investigative reports, and we've also recently published something called the Historic Transgressions list, or the Historic Transgressions reports, where we've compiled data on previous transgressions by religious or community leaders who have committed really egregious violations but are still teaching in the community or hold leadership positions in the community. We have not investigated those cases, of course, but those are, again, just data that we've compiled. And then lastly, since our founding, we've also conducted 50+ trainings and events. So in addition to publicizing our substantiated findings, we really want to help the community empower themselves and be able to take the accountability of their leadership in their own hands. And so we work really hard to make sure that we provide them with the tools and resources to be able to do that. And we also started, doing consultations for community members that come to us who may not necessarily want to investigate or want us to publish a report, but really want some help on how to handle certain situations within their own community. So we've been doing a lot of consultations since January of 2020. So that's a little bit about us. Alia, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. As-salatu was-salam ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Thank you so much for that introduction, that great introduction, Sara. What I want to really jump into is the topic at hand around what we're seeing in the community around how we can actually attempt to reduce the instances of abuse and or I think it's like a 2-part piece that we need to, at least when this stuff is going to happen, because as much as we are driving our mission towards ending this type of abuse and holding these abusers accountable, we understand that that is a really big ask. And so at minimum, we need to also be making it a better situation for our community in order to create mechanisms and support systems that lessen the impact that is created once this abuse happens and either somebody comes forward or it's uncovered. The diagram here that you see, or the picture that you see, is what we hope our state to be. So you've got your, either scales of justice or your balancing scales or whatever you want to refer to them as. But basically right now, the picture shows a person on the left-hand side. That person would be a victim or survivor of abuse, and you have the institution on the right-hand side. And as of right now, it's the opposite. We're putting the value, the scales are weighing heavy right now towards the institution, that we put a lot of value on the institution. We put a lot of focus and energy on protecting those institutions, and we end up, you know, overlooking and negating the needs of the victim, or you know, we're putting focus and attention and priorities over reputations in general. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we can get it to this state, to where we're truly centering victims and survivors, and that we're not overlooking them in favor of the institutions. It's our belief, based on these last 4 years of work, that we have to switch our mindset in how we approach these issues. I realize we are most likely speaking to the choir here, but if we can help translate this information for y'all, or transfer it to y'all, and you can, you know, help in the different areas that you serve within the community, both the local community and the broader community, we think that it'll really have a great impact. And we'll talk about the mental health implications towards the end. Sara, if you could switch the screen. Okay, so don't worry, most of our slides have nice, lovely pictures, but we do want to share some words with you. And the most important thing that we want to share when we talk about culture is our principal hadith. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Exalted, will not punish a community for the sins of a few unless they see evil appear among themselves and they are able to reject it but do not do so. If they do so, then Allah will punish the entire community along with the sinners. And so when it's talking about, you know, how we are going about and doing this work, we absolutely take this upon as a fard kifaya, that we are doing this work to answer this call, right? That we are stopping the evil from spreading. One of the primary implications when we first started working, one of the primary, I shouldn't say implications, one of the primary reasons that our model is the way that it is because we saw individuals who were either people were finding out that they had, conducted some sort of abuse. We were finding out that they would quietly either get fired or leave the locale where they were and go on to other communities, and the abuse cycle would continue over again. And so we were looking for ways to interrupt. And when I came across this hadith, it was really a powerful moment to show that this is absolutely our obligation, and Allah intended it. Now, a lot of people say, oh, Sister Alia, there's lots of ways to look at this hadith, etc. Well, this is, the research that we've done, and we've talked to scholars and how we're implementing this. And so this is a very big source of inspiration for us and what we do and how we do it. And then there's a wonderful hadith that we don't talk about often enough. When a woman went outside in the time of the Prophet for prayer, a man attacked her and raped her. She later said to the others that the man did such and such to me. They went and seized the man whom they thought had intercourse and then brought him to the Prophet. When he was about to pass the sentence, the man who actually had assaulted her stood up and said, I am the man who did this to her. The Prophet said to the woman, go away, for you have been forgiven, and for mistakenly identifying the wrong man. But he told the first man some good words. And then the man who actually had raped her, they said, to stone him to death. He also said he has repented in such an extent that if the people of Medina had repented similarly, it would have been accepted from them. And the fact that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is a sahih hadith, the fact that he automatically believed her and that he was ready to take this man and punish him was so significant in our eyes, and I'm sure many of yours. Now, we're not going to get into a topic around the types of punishment or things like that. The point is that they believed her immediately, that our Prophet believed this woman, and even to the extent that they went and grabbed that person, and it was a public event, and then there was no hiding what was going on. So this was a really significant moment for us as well when we came across this hadith. If you could switch to the next slide.
Yeah, I also just want to add in really quick, Alia, if you don't mind, the
Yeah,
last
please.
part. The last part about stone him to death, but also he has repented to such an extent, which shows this duality that people who have committed an abuse upon another person are still to be punished, whatever that looks like, are still to be held accountable. But even despite between them and Allah, they might have repented. And so we see that sometimes, I think Ali is going to get into some of the questions that we get about, well, what if this person has repented? What if, between them and Allah, like Allah has forgiven them? And it's like, yes, like that can be true, but also it can be true that they need to be held accountable. And I love this hadith because I think it's such a perfect model for how we should be treating situations like this. So just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you, that was great. So how people respond. These are a lot of the questions or the feedback, the pieces of feedback that we get when we're actually doing this work, and all the reasons why people give for either not engaging or not supporting the efforts that are trying to be made to hold these individuals accountable, etc. So I'm going to read a few of these for you. This is the police's job. Something that comes up a lot, and the reason why I put this one at the top, are people are always like, well, if they engage in these types of abuse, then shouldn't it go to the police? Well, number one, the police is not, and the police and the criminal justice system is not always a place where people can, seek restitution, where they can get justice. It is an avenue that some people want to go down. But it is also an avenue that is problematic in that there are a lot of subjective sort of approaches, especially to people in the Muslim community, to people in Black and Brown communities, etc. So there's so many different dynamics at play that don't necessarily make this an avenue for justice, or the only avenue for justice. On the flip side of it, even if it does go through a criminal court system, we've had people who've gone through the criminal court system, gone to jail, been released, and nobody is the wiser. And that's why it's so important for us as a community to be able to have this information, to make these decisions, et cetera. And so kind of changing the culture around how we look at the police and the criminal justice system and so on and so forth is really important, that we need community avenues for holding these individuals accountable. This is not Islamic. The masjid's reputation. Prioritizing the reputation is probably the number one reason why people don't want to get involved with these sort of situations. The reputation of the masjid, the reputation of the Muslim community, the reputation of the abuser, and all to say that the reputation, while here is this person who has been harmed so incredibly, and and Islam focuses so much on protecting those that are most vulnerable. Think of his family. It's a feminist agenda. What did she do to cause this? Meh, people who just don't even care about it. And then you've got this person over on the left hand side saying, who can I trust? I can never go back to my masjid again. No one will believe me. Why did Allah let this happen to me? That is the last thing that we focus on and the last thing that we hear about. And so we're really hoping to shift that focus away from all of those different competing interests and really center the victim in all of it. And of course, the person in the center, covering it up. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second as well. Okay.
Alia, I really love how you explain the concept of like private sin versus abuse. So can you also go over that a bit?
Absolutely. So with respect to private sin, I thought we were talking about that in the next section. I apologize. Private sin, sitr versus abuse, right? So sitr is the Arabic word that means to cover one's sins, like it's an action. To engage in sitr for someone. So we know that we're supposed to give somebody 70 excuses, and we're supposed to cover the sins of our brothers and sisters, etc. But abuse and karama has a great link on the website. Sara, if you could post that in the chat group. Actually, I don't know if I'm not sure how the Whova app exactly works, but if we can get that link to people, it's a really great article from Karama that said that is not the same thing as what you do for abuse. Abuse is actually has nothing to do with sin. Private sin is between you and Allah, but when somebody has been harmed and their rights have been removed from them or overshadowed by somebody else and their agenda, that becomes an aspect of abuse or oppression. Those two things are not equal and do not have the same value in how we approach them. So it's really important that we understand that as well. Okay, so some of the questions that we receive. How do you verify the allegations? Thank you, Sara. How do you verify the allegations? So we verify them by collecting evidentiary support and statements. One of the things that, and y'all have to keep me okay on time, Sara, because this piece is a little bit in detail, right? So how do you verify the allegations? We gather a lot of different, as Sara mentioned, the 7 different disciplines. We gather a lot of different information as we're performing investigations, that we gather information that may pertain to legal transgressions, Islamic transgressions, violations from an ethics perspective, from mental health to community organizing, finance, etc. Right? So we're collecting data, whether it's statements or whether it's hard evidence or whether it's examples of how these particular forms of abuse, how they can harm others, and what sorts of transgressions they are. And we collect that data and put it up against each other. And once we can have some confidence that this information is solid and it's substantiated. So we're not a court system, an adjudicatory body, so we don't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the threshold within a criminal justice system. What we do is we substantiate it or support the allegation with reasonable pieces of evidentiary support that, you know, give us some confidence that if somebody were to ever challenge us from a legal perspective, we would frame it in a way that is, first of all, oh my God, 5 minutes. Lord have mercy, 20 minutes goes by so fast. So worried about that. Thank you for the 5-minute mark. Anyway, so we just collect a lot of information. What is the point of publicizing them? So that we can interrupt the cycles of abuse that are happening. Why are you airing the Muslim community's dirty laundry? Because if we don't do it, who else is going to do it? And it's important for the Muslimin who are being abused that they see their community to be the ones to stand up and do something about it, as opposed to waiting for the media to do something. So which is better? You have your community doing something or somebody else, because it's going to come out whether we like it or not. Our default position is to definitely get the accused's statement on the record. There are a few questions that might not, or there are a few times that we might not do that, especially when the safety of anybody involved is prevalent, or the threat to one's safety is involved. We already talked about why you're exposing sin. What if they had already repented? Sara kind of alluded to that that's between them and Allah, but we have our earthly accountability that we need to go through. And do you have four witnesses? Rape is not the same thing as zina. I think everybody in this room could agree to that. Sara, if you could jump to the next one. So I think we're going to we'll skip over the real world examples so Sara can talk about the mental health implications. I apologize, we really thought we had this under 20 minutes, but there you have it. There's so much to cram in. So Sara, go ahead and talk about the mental health implications.
Okay, so how does this particular topic impact any of us as mental health professionals? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of victims may refuse to divulge what happened to them until many years afterwards because of the shame and immense fear that they won't be believed, that's heightened because of the stature that person holds within the community. And so oftentimes they won't get proper diagnosis or treatment until decades or years later, if at all. So abuse by a clergy member or community leader presents a very unique type of complex trauma that we may encounter in clinical settings, and having the language to relay these power dynamics to a survivor is essential in helping them heal. Another thing we found is that victims who are the same gender as their abuser will find themselves questioning their own sexual identity and are especially vulnerable to abusers who encourage them to remain silent due to the sin that most religions associate with homosexual behavior. And this would also cause distancing from their religious community that also would ideally be processed in therapy. One concept that's really helpful in understanding these dynamics is the concept of moral confusion, the contradiction that the victim or survivor would face about how this religious leader who they put so much trust in and faith in, how can they sin this way? And when they start to analyze that and overthink that, they start to engage in this cycle of self-blame, because here on one hand, they're elevating their spiritual status. And then on the other hand, they're engaging in this really, really sinful behavior with that victim themselves. And so they start to wonder, what's wrong with me? What did I do? Is this my fault? And so it feels like they're the ones that led the religious leader to sin. The community as a whole can also experience that moral confusion, which leads to another layer of trauma for the victim, especially when they're not believed and when they're told they can't tarnish the reputation of this really incredibly influential personality. The community, of course, cannot often fathom that someone so highly respected and regarded has engaged in this kind of abuse of power. And that can just be really, again, it can add another layer of trauma for these victims and survivors who've already suffered so much. And then lastly, holding space. In situations like this, it's really important as a recipient of this disclosure, whether in a professional capacity or not, to really hold that non-judgmental space for the victim and reorient ourselves, as Alia was mentioning earlier, to give the benefit of the doubt to the victim and the survivor. As we know, less than 1% of cases of sexual abuse are reported falsely. So the likelihood that they're telling the truth about this situation is much, much greater than the likelihood that they're not telling the truth. And when we orient ourselves in this way, we center the victim and the survivor as opposed to centering the institution or the influential abuser, et cetera, community leader. So that's a really quick summary of the mental health implications. Alia, do you want to take the conclusion?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to answer a question. Oops. I was trying to answer a question in the chat, but it's just going so fast. Maybe you can finish it up. Okay, so in conclusion, we wanted to leave you with a passage that really speaks to, hadith that really speaks to what it is that we're trying to convey, and the spirit and the prophetic example of how we must prioritize victims and vulnerable people. And that is the crux of what we want, the knowledge that we want to transmit, is how we can shift the focus away from institutions and reputational harm for anybody and towards the victim and the sacredness of the person. So in one narration, one day Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu looked at the house. Oh no, where did the presentation go? Oh, sorry, I'm not being very Zoom savvy today. No, I'm here now.
Okay.
One day Umar looked at the house or the Kaaba and said, what is it that is more honored than you? And whose honor is more sacred than yours? And the believer's honor is more sacred to Allah than yours. And the second narration, Abdullah bin Amr said, I saw the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam circumambulating the Kaaba and saying, how good you are and how good your fragrance, how great you are and how great your sanctity. By the one in whose hand is the soul of Muhammad, the sanctity of the believers is greater before Allah than your sanctity, his blood and his wealth, and to think anything but good of him. And these just really struck us in the heart of what we really want to help uplift and convey to the community. So we thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all the things that we wanted to share. We vastly overestimated what we could squeeze into 10 slides in 20 minutes, but hopefully we'll get another opportunity to publicly share more of this information in detail. Jazakumullahu khairan. We'll look forward to answering some questions in the chat.
Thank you so much. It was super insightful, and really 20 minutes certainly would not be enough. with how much you had to share. Onwards and upwards, moving on to Rishtya. Screen space is all yours.
Great, thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make our task easy for us and to untie the knots from our tongues and to help us stand up for these proper things that we're supposed to be talking about. So as I was listening to your presentation, SubhanAllah, it's like so connected. I wish we could have done like a collaboration, maybe then we could have gotten through the time limit for both of us. So I'm gonna try as much as possible to not overlap, but it's beautiful that we did have such similar things to talk about. I think that shows, gives credibility more to this kind of research as well. So I just want to provide a trigger warning before I go into more details that I'm going to be talking about in detail issues of sexual violence and sexual abuse, and make sure you're in a safe space and that you can take care of yourself and that you're free to leave at any time as well. So this is a part of my dissertation research on exploring the opportunities for child sexual abuse prevention in American Muslim communities, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to present the whole dissertation here today, but this is just one part of a three parts of it. So this is sort of the full model of my dissertation, but today we're just going to be talking about this top portion here because I think that's what's most relevant to the professionals that are in the audience today, or the audience here today. But just to let you know that at the end, I'm going to try to connect it back to that context-specific system and really the root causes of what's all going on, because I am a public health practitioner. I don't have any qualifications in mental health whatsoever, but really focused on public health. And so I have to sort of, in this scenario, give you some of that public health learning as well, hopefully. And a really, really important perspective in public health is to keep asking the question, why? And so that's what I'd really like for you, anytime you are approaching a public health issue, to think about it in that sense. Here, I really like analogies as well to explain these kinds of things. And so I want us to, throughout this presentation, consider the analogy of a tree. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, I'll be able to get you back to what that really means. So usually for public health, these kinds of analogies, you might see a tree like this, where it talks about the issue. For example, we were talking about child sexual abuse. And then we talk about, what you see really above ground is the effects of it, what you all might see in your clinics, the kinds of people who come and present to you, like all those effects that are on their life, those detrimental consequences. But I just want to show this picture because when you look at a tree from the top, you really can't tell. This might look like broccoli to some people, right? You can't tell how big that tree is. You can't tell how long the trunk is. You can't tell how long it's been there for. You don't know what's beneath the ground, right? There's so much you don't know. And I was actually approaching my dissertation this way. And after the part that I'm talking about today, I found that we're actually at this stage still. We're still, the only thing that we know, the only thing that we're seeing around in our community about this issue is sort of the very top. We have no idea what's beneath. We have no idea what's going on in the forest, actually. And that's really what my dissertation is about, is like going into that depth and trying to figure out what's beneath the ground, right? And asking that question, why, that I was talking about in public health. Why does it happen? But not only why does it happen, like what are the root causes? You might hear that very often, but more so, why does it really happen? What are the conditions in the soil that's leading that tree to keep growing there? So even when we try to cut it off, even when we try to uproot it, it's still growing again. And so I might not get to that fully in this presentation, but maybe towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about that. Just some important concepts for you to keep thinking about. Okay, and of course, in this analogy, just to help you maybe center where you're at as mental health professionals, probably many of you are dealing with these aspects, right? What helps victims heal? And that's also a very, very important aspect as well. And so this presentation, hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that. So for those of you who might not know, right, how the extent of child sexual abuse, I want you to imagine, this is a quote from Dr. John Mercy, and I want you to imagine hearing the news of a new childhood disease. A disease that increases the incidence of anxiety, depression, suicide, higher risk of chronic diseases, substance use, and further victimization. I think all of you know this and probably have seen it in your clinics. What if 300 million children around the world are affected by this disease? That would be equal to the 4th largest country in the world. And the truth is that we do have such a disease, and that is child sexual abuse. And this was actually trying to convince public health professionals why child sexual abuse is a public health issue that can be prevented. And I hope that most of you know that child maltreatment, including child sexual abuse, is considered to be the single most preventable cause of mental health issues later on in adulthood as well. So, by the WHO. Another thing that we often hear in the community as well, it's not really in our communities. And actually, when I was sampling for my study, I did hear people, completely rejected to be participants in the study because, it's not an issue in our community, right? So it's very, very important and crucial for everybody to understand that according to all the research, child sexual abuse is a widespread issue that's present globally within all societies across all ethnic, socioeconomic, and religious groups. And for those of you who want to really know about the research, there is these are 3 meta-analyses that have been done from around the world, 22 countries, 6 continents, looking at all the different studies that have been done. However, the problem comes in the gap, right? So the gap is that actually there hasn't been a single study that's done on American Muslims in child sexual abuse. Not a single empirical study has been done. There's been a lot of commentary on it. A lot of people think that they know what's going on, but nothing has really been looked into it. So everything that I'm presenting now in the background is sort of, for the global thing that we can sort of assess, but we don't really know in our community what's going on. So just so that all of you know, this research shows that 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 girls are sexually abused before they reach the age of 18. And between 1 in 8 to 1 in 10 boys are sexually abused before they reach the age of 18. Globally, in every community, these are the averages. Now, the thing is, this data actually is, let me focus on this also, is that one thing that was very surprising to a lot of people when they hear is you might hear a lot about sexual violence going on in adults, but if you combine all of the sexual violence that happens to children and adults, 70% of all those cases are in children. And most commonly starts under the age of 13, with usually the peak first age being between 9 and 10. So how many children disclose their sexual abuse? And this is really important to understand, out of 100 children who experience abuse, 33%, a third, tell someone. 57% of children never tell anyone. So again, the data on how many children are abused is, again, it's very difficult to measure. And then the question becomes, well, what happens, right? And I really appreciate the first panel's explanation of this, and the details of that and nuances of that are so important to understand, is that oftentimes there's so much responsibility and so much onus is placed on children. Or, they have to tell, and why don't they tell? And there's so much research on this. But after 2 decades of research on trying to look into why children tell or why they don't tell, nothing's really changed. And the reason is because we keep placing the responsibility on children. Why is that? Because even when they do tell, what happens? Not much. Not much changes for most people, and we'll see specifically in my research how in our community that happens. And the reason we know that not much happens is you can see among 100 people who have reported sexual abuse officially, this is U.S. data, general U.S. data, only 3% of cases are actually reported officially. And then of those, I can't even put on the screen, less than 1%, any charges are actually filed, right? So 97% of cases are never reported officially. All right, so that's the general. Now getting into the sort of the disclosure research, right? There's a lot of research, as I mentioned, that's been on on child sexual abuse disclosure. However, even the experts in this field note that there is a gap in terms of looking at it from a community context, looking at it from the environmental context of the social, cultural, and religious context that affect these disclosure processes. An important thing to understand is the effect of the various responses on survivor outcomes. So, for example, the fact that, oftentimes it was thought that resiliency and healing was dependent on how severe the case was. But now the research shows that healing and resiliency, the primary factor for that is how someone responds to them when they tell. their supportive responses, that affects their healing and resiliency. And this is something that's in the literature, and you'll see how, you know, in my research, how that comes out, and it's a very important aspect to remember as well. All right, and so we have this research gap of no research so far on empirical research on child sexual abuse in American Muslims. And we also have the research gap of the disclosure processes, looking at it from a more cultural, religious context perspective and taking those into consideration really to improve disclosures further. All right. So just to clarify, some of the methodological frameworks that I've used for this research are participatory action research. And so because this issue is such a sensitive and stigmatized, politicized issue in our community, and you can imagine how wary the community is to even participate in this kind of research because they would fear that it's weaponized against them. It's really, really important to build that trust with the community, have a collaborative approach, and make sure that the community and the participants have control over and ownership of the results as well. So I really focused on that. I used critical theory as well because in this theory, knowledge is for the sake of decolonizing, healing, and mobilizing, and explicitly targeting those existing power structures to raise critical consciousness. And one of my favorite quotes about critical theory that I hope you'll see later on is that community members are capable of analyzing their own situations and designing their own solutions. And so I really want you to consider that as we go through the results as well. All right. I use qualitative research because there's no research on this art, and we really need an exploratory approach that goes in depth to really understand those complex mechanisms. And also qualitative is necessary for empowering the individuals to share their stories, hear their voices, and minimize the power relationships that exist between a researcher and the participants in the study. And then I used constructivist grounded theory. So this goes beyond descriptive qualitative research to really try with the purpose of theory building and to really focus on the processes that are involved. And usually the ideal number for constructivist grounded theory is 20 to 30 participants. All right, so this was set in a northern US city, which has a very large and diverse growing community of American Muslims. I used purposive sampling and maximum variation to, really the purpose was to get as broad and different types of people so that I could really in detail find out what are the variations of approaches here. So gender, ethnicity, generational experience, and other kinds of experiences as well. I was also focused on adult, fluent in English, those who identified as Muslim and were sort of connected with a Muslim space, because the goal of this process was to eventually come up with an intervention that can be given through a Muslim space as well. So we had multi-stage collection, data collection analysis, which was as part of grounded theory, and inductive data analysis is another technique in grounded theory as well. So there was a mix of religious leaders, topic experts, community organizers, and general community members as well. All right. If the organizers could let me know when there's like 10 minutes left as well, that would be great. I'm bad at time too. All right.
7 minutes left.
7 minutes, okay.
Yeah.
So just to let you know that I did achieve the maximum variation. You can see here really a great range of ethnicities. We had converts, we had 1 or 2 Hispanic, you know, even the Somali, Arab, South Asian, some mixed ethnicity. And I'm gonna just sort of skip over some of this, but some of the things I was really looking at, the participants included topic experts, religious leaders, community organizers, and community members. And so I had intensive interviews with 22 participants that lasted, they were supposed to last an hour, but people just couldn't stop talking, and they would go above 2 hours. And so coding all of that data in this inductive analysis technique was very time consuming, but very, very fulfilling as well. One thing I want you to recognize here is that 19 out of 22 of the participants had heard of a case in the community. 17 of them had been disclosed to directly, and then 5 identified as a victim or a survivor during the interview. I didn't purposefully seek victims or survivors because, again, this was an exploratory approach. And what this allowed for the disclosure process was that it allowed to find out what community members are saying, what people have heard community members say, what they might have said, and to really allow a more broad approach as well. All right, So this was the resulting model, the spectrum of responses to CSA disclosure. So we have here on the right-hand side 4 supportive responses. This is the generated model. So, sorry. So in this whole model, the responses include verbal, nonverbal, and action responses as well. So on the supportive side, participants emphasize that a supportive response to disclosure is one that has explicitly empathizing, reassuring, and validating responses. And just a quote from this aspect, one of the participants who was a survivor talked about how when she was at a suicidal point in her life, the thing that turned it around was when her father came to her and told her, it's not your fault, and it's never been the fault of anyone who has been abused. And that really changed her whole feeling of healing and resiliency, her whole path along that as well. Another thing was to prioritize the child's needs, and participants sort of differed here on how to best protect children from further harm. Seeking others' help. So what was very interesting is that all participants said that that people should go to professionals for support. However, the professionals that I interviewed, they had never received a single client of Muslim CSA, whereas the religious leaders and the community organizers had heard, many cases. It was a very big disconnect in terms of the Muslims, where Muslims were going in the community. Holding abusers fully responsible was another aspect that was really sort of people had completely different views on how they should be held responsible in terms of whether taking a more punishing approach. And really the frustration really came out, a lot of what the last panel talked about, the frustration really came out of really not knowing what to do and where to go. And I think FACE is such a great example of where that can really fit in right there. But generally, for many participants, their rationalizations for these supportive responses and accountability were strongly tied to concepts of justice in the Quran and Hadith. All right, so going to the harmful responses, the participants heard, very commonly that the dismissing, minimizing, and hiding. This is probably one of the most common responses in the community, often referred to as sweeping it under the carpet. And I'm going to come a little bit more to these harmful responses in a bit when I talk about rationalization. So we're just going to put that on pause for a little bit. And I really want to get to stuck in between. So stuck in between is the concept that sort of came from the data, really questioning that data that didn't really fit into the supportive or harmful responses, right? And it's this concept of being stuck in between wanting to believe and having this feeling like you need more evidence, right? Or you feel like you need necessary proof, right? And it leads to this lack of meaningful action or action paralysis, okay? So what often happens in this is that, I'll just read some quotes. The mother decided, no, I'm not going to be able to do that, meaning to expose the abuser, because I don't know if this really happened or not. She didn't quite say I don't believe her, but she also didn't say I believe her and I stand with her. And the mother never cut relations with the uncle. And in another situation, one of the therapists or the professionals that I interviewed said, it doesn't even matter if your child told the truth or not. Your child is trying to get at something. So seeking therapeutic services still makes sense, and all those steps would remain necessary regardless of whether or not the child is telling the truth. So there's this concept, and oftentimes something that was kind of scary for me was that one of the participants who had received the most disclosures of child sexual abuse, her main recommendation to the mothers that asked her for help said that the first thing you need to do is take them to the doctor and say, my child is saying this, but I'm not really sure. Can you do the medical report, and are you able to find anything? And this, this idea of like, oh, we need to investigate, we need to discover, we need to figure out what's going on before even showing any kind of empathy and support and the necessary requirements of that supportive response.
1 minute left.
All right, let's figure this out. Okay, so this was all sort of my initial model. The thing is, all of you might be saying, well, okay, or some of you might be saying these are things that we might have heard in other communities. First of all, this is really important for Muslims and American Muslims because this is the first kind of research with American Muslims. But the real question, as I mentioned, in public health, we ask why. So why do community members respond this way? And so the crux of most of my research was focusing on those rationalizations that I call. So rather than just stopping at the dismissing, minimizing, and hiding, but there were actually common rationalizations that participants heard from the community members or had themselves about for the reasons for it. And it's interesting because almost all of these, I think, Alia and Sara covered in their presentation, right? The concept of you're not supposed to expose other people's sins, the concept of modesty, or don't talk about this, or especially the concept of supporting and protecting the abuser, things about ruining the abuser's reputation, right? He's done so much for the community. These are all kinds of things that participants talked about hearing. And part of my research was looking at where are these coming from, right? Where are these rationalizations coming from? What are the reasons for these rationalizations? What are the reasons truly behind these rationalizations? And so those were geared in, the aspects of cultural understandings of shame, religious assertions, right? So, and oftentimes misinterpretations, as many participants talked about them being misinterpretations, sociopolitical oppression. So for example, they focused on, they're going to think we're all like that, and worrying about how the reputation of the Muslim community will be, especially after 9/11, those kinds of things. And when you look at all of these, they're actually all rooted in and are acted upon the concept of power. And sort of my next paper goes into really looking at why those concepts of power, how they're related, and how we can then tackle those especially. So, I was going to go into some more details. I know it was way too much to explain. I just want to, let me see. Okay, so then the next concept. Let me just back out here and find the. Find the one I was looking for. All right, sorry about that. So, as I mentioned, the concept of in critical theory and participatory action research, we really focus on highlighting the participants' voices and the fact that they themselves know the solutions to their problems. Community members themselves know the solutions to their problems. So when we talk about rationalizations, it was amazing that all of the participants also had responses to those rationalizations, right? And how they themselves deal with those, the harmful rationalizations, and how they can promote the supportive responses. So, and many of these, again, Alia and the first panel mentioned these, right? The hadith and the examples from the hadith and the sunnah in the Quranic ayats talking about justice, talking about, the Quran was revealed for the victims of oppression or dhulm. The hadith about responsibility to stop munkar, harm or evil, with your action, with your speech, and with your heart. And these go on and on, right? So it's as a researcher myself, as a Muslim researcher, trying to ensure, again, that participatory action research aspect, it was very important for me to highlight these and publish them, right? Because I think this is what's lacking also in the existing research that does not center Muslim voices as well. All right, so in conclusion, this specific part of my dissertation, to improve the disclosure responses in the diverse American Muslim community, our interventions should recognize the power of disclosure responses on survivor outcomes, right? That aspect of how powerful it is, the supportive or harmful response in a victim's healing and resiliency and their outcomes. And one important thing about that is that community members actually didn't know that, and participants didn't know that. And so this is something that we can really emphasize in all of our interventions. Second, to prioritize the use of supportive, survivor-centered responses over the perceived necessity of evidence, right? And this is that important aspect of getting people who are responding to this out of the stuck in between. So rather than telling them believe victims, rather it should be support victims, right? Because believing still feels like, oh, I need the evidence to get to belief, right? So focusing on survivor-centered response.
I hate to interrupt, but we really do have to kind of.
All right.
Look
Thank
at,
you so much. I appreciate that. I apologize
no
for running over time.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Rishtya. I can't wait to read it in print. I hope you get it in there soon. Looks like an incredible good methodology and a great study. Time to get on our next panelist. Bushra, the screen space is all yours.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Give me 1 second as I'm just pulling everything up. Okay. All right. So like I said, my name is Bushra Husain. I'm here to talk about understanding the challenges related to forced marriage. I work at an organization called Sanctuary for Families. We're based in New York City, and we're a gender-based violence organization. And we provide services to gender-based violence victims. So that means domestic violence, intimate partner violence, family violence, trafficking, female genital mutilation, and also forced marriage. We provide clinical services. So we provide counseling to adult and children. We also have an entire legal department that works on orders of protection, custody, visitation, immigration, trafficking, and divorce. And then we have a job readiness program that we really help a lot of survivors in getting back on their feet, considering the abuse and violence that they've gone through. And we do a lot of advocacy, both on state level, policy level, and federal level. So I wanted to start off by providing like a very basic case example. I have some really very interesting cases that I come across in my practice, and I thought I would just share a very simple one. I'm hoping to sort of interweave it throughout the presentation. So this is a very common issue that I come across. So Sara is a freshman in college, and she migrated to the United States when she was 10 years old. The family is well known and respected within their community, and they're educated and hardworking, and parents who are also really very religious and proud of their culture. Sara and her family are also green card holders, and she's at the age of marriage, and her parents and family start to pressure her to comply and meet with several potential suitors. But if Sara does not comply or go through with the marriage, her parents have threatened to take away her green card. She is also facing a dilemma. She'd like to continue with her education, but at the same time, she feels that she doesn't want to disappoint her family. And she discloses this information to the counselor at the college counseling center. So I just want you to keep this case example in mind, and we'll sort of like talk a little bit about how this sort of fits within forced marriage, and also how you sort of sit with this right now in terms of thinking about whether this is a forced marriage or not. So before we get into that, we're going to get into definitions. Oftentimes forced marriage is conflated and confused with this understanding of arranged marriage. Really, arranged marriage is about bringing families and communities. Well, they're technically involved in selecting the potential spouses and suitors, but really the decision to accept or reject the arrangement remains with the individuals. It's also about uniting families. It's also about preserving and building community, also property possibly, and also businesses. In a lot of immigrant families, we're seeing joint family systems, right? So it's also about giving respect to a lot of our elders for finding, suitors for their loved ones, which is also very common. And it's also really, for a lot of clients that are living with joint family systems, it's also making sure that do we share the same values, the religion, the food, the culture, or the clothing and things like that, that we sort of really are commonly important when you're living together with one another. But then on the other spectrum, I do want to say though, in Islam, arranged marriage is not required. And so, it does become a very cultural practice. So I do want you to think about that. Although I do get a lot of clients who also say, but I'm also not allowed, Muslim clients, I'm also not allowed to engage with the opposite sex, right? So how does this really sort of work in sort of finding marriage partners and suitors? And then you have the other spectrum of things where a love marriage, which is a term that's primarily used in the South Asian community, to really sort of distinguish between arranged marriages that are, where families and community members are involved, really where the marriage is really decided by the couple without consulting with their family members. All right. And then getting to forced marriage. Forced marriage is a lack of full and free and informed consent on one or both spouses. And the reason would be like the lack of capacity. That could be age. So in this case example that I just talked about, we don't really know Sara's age. Yes, we know that she went to college, but we probably don't know her age in that respect. So I want you to think about right now there's like a national movement throughout the United States where I've been part of sort of raising the age of marriage. There's a lot of loopholes and exceptions to those rules where family members are the ones who can sign off on papers to have their children married off. But really what we see in forced marriage situations is the presence of familial community pressure, coercion, deception, violence, and fraud, which is very commonly things that we see in intimate partner violence relationships, other forms of trafficking, FGM, and whatnot. All right. I wanted to use this spectrum. This is a spectrum that was created by Vidya Shri. She's out in upstate New York. And this shows how an arranged marriage could become forced. Oftentimes when I'm working with clients, there is a lot of confusion about, well, isn't this the way things normally are? And so I use this to really help people to see the difference. And so I'm just gonna walk you through it. And then I want you to think about where you sit with thinking about Sarah's example. All right, so stage one is where the family suggests the need for marriage. The family insists control of the process. The individual sort of questions the intent. The family then dismisses the need for consent. The family uses blaming and shaming and reinforces it with violence. The individual is denied the right and the individual is then forced into a marriage. So for clients that come to see me for individual counseling, they usually get this spectrum. It really helps them it's like a psychoeducational tool that helps them to externalize the issue. And they know that they come in weekly for counseling to really sort of determine what stage are they, right? So every week could be different. Today, they could feel like I'm at stage 3, but then maybe I'm at stage 5 or 6. And for service providers like myself, that really helps me to do safety planning to understand what are the steps that we need to do to ensure the safety of the person, all right? And just to give you some statistics, right? So what is forced marriage looking like in the United States? In 2011, Tahiri Justice Center had done a survey with 500 service providers, and they found that as many as 3,000 known and suspected forced marriage cases in the United States. And they came from various different communities and at least 56 different countries of origin and various religious backgrounds. But as you're seeing this list, India is the highest, and then you have Saudi Arabia being the lowest. You're also seeing a lot of Muslim countries, Muslim represented countries on this list. So I think also the issue of forced marriage is normally seen as an immigrant issue, but we're also seeing this as an issue that's happening in the United States. These could be first generation, second generation individuals that have been, migrated because their families have migrated here. But again, it also does happen in the American community, in the Caucasian community, not just brown and Black communities. And then I also just wanted to share some other statistics. So a lot of the forced marriages in the United States, there's been a lot of surveys and research that's been done with college students. And, DANC had done a first national survey on adults and really just looking at the prevalence. But again, many of those reported wanting to comply with the marriage in order to uphold family honor. And again, a value that is also really, really very important for Muslims, but also for a lot of different communities. And then Seti Yetu, which is an African women's organization in New York City, had done a support group with girls, and 28 out of the 30, reported feeling extreme pressure to marry before their 18th birthday. And they also felt that if they denied or delayed the marriage, that they'd be disowned by their families and communities. And then CUNY had done a study that they were mainly looking at Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African descent students, and that 84% of them knew someone who had experienced a forced marriage or knew someone who did not want to be married. So again, just looking at the prevalence, just looking at the research that is out there that's happening most recently. So when we think about forced marriage, why is this underreported? Oftentimes people see this as a cultural issue, not a gender-based violence issue. Forced marriage survivors are often afraid of getting their families in trouble, right? Calling the police, getting support. Both of these issues, both being a cultural issue and not, speaking out and or afraid of getting their family members into trouble is a very similar concern that we came across in the domestic violence field, right? Nobody wanted to speak out about the issue. And I oftentimes have the same problem like speaking out in the Muslim community, where it's very, very hard, where people don't want to talk about this issue. It's very taboo. And oftentimes, specifically for this issue, it's really confused with arranged marriage. I have a lot of clients who will say, well, isn't this the way that things are? And so it is really important for people to know their rights and to understand the difference between arranged and forced, and to really also parse out their religious beliefs that are often fueled by this practice and are used to distort a lot of our own religious beliefs and cultural beliefs. There's also lack of a working definition. So in New York City, we're working on trying to understand and come to a consensus on the definition itself. And Tahiri Justice Center found that there were less than 22% of organizations throughout the United States that had a working definition or understood what forced marriage was. And then the other issue is that, forced marriage, coincides with all these other forms of gender violence, whether that be FGM, sexual assault, trafficking. So like my other colleagues who just spoke earlier, we do see that a lot of trauma survivors that, forced marriage survivors are also experiencing a lot of trauma in their childhoods. And so, whether that be sexual violence, sexual assault, and witnessing domestic violence in the home as well. So some of the common reasons that used to justify, so we talked a little bit about this, shame and honor, or like our family's honor is at stake. So if you don't marry this person, it will bring shame. And like I said, this is usually not the first experience in which honor and shame and guilt is really put on the victim and the survivor. Oftentimes tradition, right? That we must uphold this tradition. And this is how it's always been done. The status of the parents and religious values are oftentimes questioned, right? Your religion teaches you to obey and respect your parents and your elders, so therefore you must agree to the marriage. Like I mentioned, there are threats to disown. So you won't be able to live with us, we'll cut you off, you won't be able to go to college if you don't. And think about in Sarah's situation, the green card situation that's that's at stake. Sorry, I'm just taking a look. Okay. So at Sanctuary for Families, we were able to get Sara an immigration attorney, so she was able to also think about severing her immigration case with her family. And again, still allowing the family unit to be intact, but allowing Sara to be able to still pursue her dreams, her passions, and her desires in a way that might also differ with her family in a way. But I also do want to just mention, I have a lot of clients will talk about hadith that are talking about the importance of maintaining family relationships. So what do I do if I don't go through with this? How will this hurt my family? Isn't it my responsibility to uphold these family relationships, which I think are really key? I put in some assessment questions. What just happened? Assessment questions to really sort of help you guys to figure out and help to parse out like what is the survivor's experience and what do they want, and help them to understand if this is a forced marriage. So are you being pressured? What will say no mean? How is the marriage partner being selected? So really also just sort of taking a step away from the religion, because oftentimes we will stigmatize based on Islam doesn't give women these rights. And, and of course, unfortunately, we're seeing a lot more women who are at risk of a forced marriage, but this is not to say that men are not. I have worked with many, many male survivors as well. And so things that you didn't know about Sara. So if you would ask those assessment questions, you would have found out that there was a secret relationship, that you witnessed domestic violence in the home. So you're already seeing this power and control dynamic that's been starting off from the very, very beginning. So this perpetuation of abuse and violence, and her need to sort of constantly help and support the family in times of need, which is again, separate from the religious beliefs, right, on its own. We also, when you question Sara, you also realize that there's like the family that's monitoring her whereabouts, the threatening to abandon her back in her home country, and then also that this older sister has married outside of the community. So again, it's her responsibility to really uphold the family values and whatnot. These are all risk factors, and I want you to just think about, how you think the college counselor, because now she's now disclosed this information to the college counselor about what's happening in her life, and how do you think that went about? Just to kind of give you a short run through, when she had mentioned this to the college counselor then reached out to her family and felt like this would be a good opportunity for them to talk about this, which ended up having Sara not being able to come back to college. So she was not able to continue with her education, and that was actually really very detrimental, and then could put her at risk for more forms of violence or experience other forms of violence. I don't know why. Okay, here we go. I wanted to bring up Title IX. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Title IX. Title IX is a federal grant. I see a lot of people shaking their heads. I have really had the opportunity of sort of in New York City being able to work with a lot of Title IX attorneys. So for a lot of my forced marriage clients who are at risk of a forced marriage, we've been able to help them get attorneys, able to look at have them be able to get protections in schools and universities. So this is a federal law that was created in 1972, really to protect against sex discrimination, but also to any students that are experiencing any sexual violence, whether that be at school, intimate partner violence, but really to help and protect them, but to give them opportunities for further protection. And so forced marriage is now being seen as a form of gender-based violence. And so that's been a great opportunity for us to work very closely with Title IX officers and people within the university system. So I have clients who, for example, are being pressured to marry. So in Sara's situation, I was able to advocate for, in New York City, if anybody knows, housing is one of the hardest things to find in New York City. And we've been able to advocate and get a few of our clients free housing within the college system because of the pressure to marry, which was then, putting a huge strain on their education system. And so I bring this up because Title IX has been super, super helpful for a lot of our clients to be able to continue with their education. And again, whatever relationship that they want to maintain, and that's my job, is really to help them to figure that out and help them to figure out what boundaries they want to set, but also be able to utilize protections for themselves outside. And so that's been helpful. So the last piece I really just wanted to touch on was just like safety planning and resources. There is no federal law, there is no law in the United States that is against a forced marriage. Whereas if you go to the UK, since 2005, they've had like a forced marriage unit, a protection unit, but in the United States, we don't. And obviously every state has very different rules and regulations. In New York City, we're really pushing to make sure that hotline workers, people, service providers, doctors, pediatricians are aware of this term and understand, also within the community as well. And so because of that, we've been able to make sure that they are eligible for domestic violence shelters and seen as gender-based violence survivors. We always remind that the client, that consent is required. Of course, 911 is a possibility, but we understand that that is very, very, it doesn't always necessarily maybe go that way. It might not always be helpful is what I mean. Oftentimes we'll have officers who'll say, well, that's great. You're an adult. If this is an adult or if this is a child, then you must, go to a child welfare to be able to get that help. In New York State and New York City, we've been able to get orders of protection for a lot of our clients. And that has also been helpful in family court because it allows us to build that relationship, build that communication that we need for the families to really communicate with one another. Obviously, doing a safe, safety plan, figuring out where a safe place may go. If you're going abroad, there's a lot of different ways of documenting your stay. And if you're a minor, it's in notifying Child Protective Services. And there is a free texting opportunity for forced marriage survivors or those who are at risk to be able to call and text for free if they need any services in their area. So I think that's about it. I'll answer any questions that you might have. Thank you so much. Let's stop my screen sharing.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Screen's all yours, Ikram. Put it all into context for us.
Oh boy. Well, thank you so much for all of you. It's very refreshing to see somebody's actually taking the time to do this work, because this is a work that's so much needed. I will tell you, we are a community of denial. We do not want to hear those type of things about our people, because we are good and things like that don't happen in our communities. So I'm glad this work is being done. As a sexual assault therapist, I would say 80 to 85% of my clients experience child sexual abuse, and that's what they're being treated for now. So the more you wait on the trauma, the worse it gets, the more it becomes so complex, and it's a lot harder, and it takes much more time to treat it. So I'm glad this work is being done. I'm glad that early intervention is so important, and I'm glad that you guys are in this field with me. I have a couple of follow-up questions that I want to ask, and then we have a whole lot of questions here that we'll try to get through as much as we can before our next session. But one of my first question was for Alia and Sara. I was wondering how the survivors are connecting with you. How do they know about your services, or how are you reaching out to them?
Assalamu alaikum. So we have a couple of different avenues. Of course, we get a lot of outreach on social media. People can message our social media platforms, but primarily we get messages, reports, contact forms, or phone calls through our website and our main number. People can go to our website, facetogether.org, and you can select either to submit an allegation report, or you can fill out a contact form and reach us, or our phone number, which is on there, receives phone calls and text messages. And so we make that avenue. The part of the problem is that getting that into the hands of survivors, community members, victims, etc., is a little bit more difficult. So we rely a lot on people who are familiar with our work to have it at their disposal. A lot of therapists are familiar, not everybody obviously, but we have a lot of people that we work with who get people in touch with us if they're bringing up issues of abuse by religious leaders, and so they disseminate that. So we try to go through all those different avenues and be as accessible as possible, but certainly we have a really long way to go before it reaches like a cacophony of knowledge out there that people are aware of how they can reach us. But we rely heavily on community knowledge and professionals to get that information out there.
Absolutely. And there is a follow-up question that's asking about, are you specifically just working with victims or the survivors and or do you have any services for their families as well? So when you find out there's a child that was involved in a situation, do you connect with the family, and is there resources and support system in place for those families?
Absolutely. So even though we don't provide direct services, our direct services are investigation and education. But we do have a grant funder who pays for therapy for victims and directly impacted family members. So for example, we have one of our cases that we're working on pretty avidly right now is a young man who was abused by his youth group leader, and him and his family members, his mother and his father, and his cousin, who have been helping him through this, have been offered therapy through it, because there is not as much impacted, but almost as much impact. Like, they've been with him from the second he disclosed. And it's been really hard on them because they've been ostracized from the community and whatnot. So we try to make it available to firsthand, anybody, like the person who reports it, if they have firsthand knowledge, and people, even some sources, we've made this service available to them because they might have a role that is a little bit more intimate than just a regular person who's contributing, who might know something. So we really try to, make it available to people, especially when we see, and Sara is really good about, from a mental health perspective, helping us understand people who are showing visible signs of distress as a result of dealing with this. And so we, kind of offer that and do mental health intakes. Sara does the mental health intakes and sees where people are at, if people express suicidal thoughts or tendencies, and so on. So we're very careful to make sure we try to pick up on stuff, or if they give us verbal cues and what have you, and get them into therapy. We don't provide the therapy, but we do outsource it, and it gets paid for up to 10 sessions.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that's very helpful to know. I do have a question for Rishtya. It's amazing information you put out there, a lot of information you put out there. And I heard you talk about, like, I like to understand why things happen. And being in this field, especially speaking with the Muslim community, a lot of times the things that I hear are sexual assault happiness outside of the Muslim family, and it happens because they have no faith, they have no religion, they have, like, we always blame it, like the lack of faith is the reason it happens. And I'm curious, what did you find in terms of why does that happen in our community? And as a follow-up, why is there no research done in America, like in American Muslim communities? Like, what are the barriers that American Muslim are struggling with in terms of doing this type of research?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It was really good questions. So I'd just like to tell the answer to sort of both of those is sort of explaining and how I got into this research. So I was in public health and planning my dissertation. I had a completely different topic in mind, and I, had lots of disclosures of CSA and family and friends at a certain time, and I was like, okay, my public health mind, I can go into the research and I can find the evidence-based programs, and I'm going to know exactly what to do and how to help the situation in my community that I had found. And when I went there and I saw that there wasn't, any necessarily research from Muslims themselves, and anything that was mentioned in the research about Muslims going through this was sort of a commentary, what people thought about it. And the thing that really bothered me, to be honest, why I started this is that I saw people blaming the religion, right? So like sort of what you're saying is that within Muslims, you sort of see them saying, oh, it's not Muslim people. If you're religious, it's not going to happen to you, right? Yes, this is a very common thing. Whereas from people outside the religion, right, sort of looking in on the religion, they sort of say, well, it's the religion's fault. It's because, I even read a paper that said, oh, it's because people wear hijab, or it's because there's segregation, that's why this happens, right? And I was like, this really drove something in me. I was like, okay, we really need to understand the true reasons why this is happening from Muslims' own voices and from their own perspectives, right? And sort of something that I said that really stuck out with me is, if we don't talk about it, who's going to talk about it? And I've, of course, had so many people come up to me, why are you researching this? Why are you talking about this? Why are you spreading this information about the Muslim community? All those kinds of things. And then to get to that point of, so the crux of the matter of why does child sexual abuse happen? It's not because someone is religious or not religious. That has nothing to do with it, right? It has to do with power in every society and in every community, right? Sexual violence, sexual abuse happens at the nexus of power and control, and it's and my my next couple of papers talk about how can we now leverage the information we know about the community and how the community talks about these issues in a way that we can now use an intervention and explain to the community the real causes of child sexual abuse as being due to power and control. Because if you go to anyone and you tell them it's because of power and control, like, what are you talking about? It's such a difficult concept, even for researchers to understand, and it's such a difficult concept for any community members to understand. And so just a little bit look into that is, I found that community members did understand the concept of respecting women and children's bodies, right? And so that's one way of framing it. There's a few other ways of framing it as well, in terms of explaining that concept. For example, one is oppression, right? Muslims understand the concept of oppression and dhulm. And so framing power and control in those ways so that they understand those root causes. And because what happens when we put blame on the wrong things is then that's when you have those very negative responses, those very shaming responses to disclosure, right? People start shaming and blaming the victim when you don't understand what the root causes are, right? So I hope that sort of answered some of those questions.
Yeah, thank you. Very helpful. There is a question, I think it's related, so I'm just going to open it up to all the panelists here. What suggestions do you have on those who are blaming? Oh, wait, hold on. Okay, yeah. So what suggestions do you have in regard to collaborating with religious leaders and members to work on the issues you have raised? What kind of model do you use?
I'll go ahead and answer that from our perspective. So it's a little bit precarious. It has been a little bit precarious in who is able to publicly work with us. So we work with a lot of people behind the scenes, but because our particular work, especially in relation to conducting investigations, because there's still not a lot of I don't know, there's not a lot of, we have a long way to go in terms of trusting face, right? And trusting what we're doing to be in the best interest of our community and to be something that's Islamically acceptable, et cetera. So there's a navigation that has to happen for leaders, but behind the scenes, and we make this completely possible, because in the beginning, I was literally flying across the country and like knocking on people's doors and being like, excuse me, we need some support for what we're trying to do here. And they'd be like, yes, I love this, but not publicly, thank you. You know, because there was just so much trepidation. So what we did was we kind of abandoned that model and started just making it possible to work with them behind the scenes. We get a lot of reports from religious leaders who want to have an avenue to hold their colleagues accountable. They don't want to risk they don't want to risk themselves in a way that would people would mistrust them, or people would think something as a result of, if that makes sense, which is, you know, people are going to have thoughts and opinions. They'll be like, what? You just need to be brave and say it, and, you know, whatever. But on the flip side, people will, I mean, cancel culture is real. People will be like, oh, you are a raging, you know, feminazi who's out to get the community, or they will, you know, blame them for something as a result. So we try to make it as accessible to work with us as possible without risking one's own livelihood, reputation, et cetera, because there's just structures in place right now that don't allow for safe participation. And we want to acknowledge it, because the biggest goal here is to get everybody involved as possible, because it's going to take all of us to do it. So I hope that answers the question. As time goes on, and as we keep doing, because we're not going to stop, right? Just because there are people who disagree. As we keep doing this, I think the trust has built a lot, and it's going to continue to build. And so I think that'll help kind of break down some of the barriers, and people, once they figure out who we are and how we operate, they'll come forward and we'll get people, but it just takes time.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I hate to be the person who has to do this in the middle of a real interesting discussion, but we're out of time. We're starting with our closing ceremony. I'm hoping you all will join us. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Ikram, for being an excellent discussant. For all the attendees, the closing ceremony is starting right now. Assalamu alaikum.